Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. We're here to help you get the most out of your law school experience. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Careers site. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School in all her spare time. Each episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast is designed to demystify the law school and early legal career experience, so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We'll talk about academics, careers, and life, since all three are critical to success and happiness. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com or by emailing Alison, Alison, at lawschooltoolbox.com or Lee, Lee, at lawschooltoolbox.com. And with that, let's get started. In this episode, we'll be talking about how you can stay true to yourself and live with integrity as a law student and as a lawyer. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're going to talk about a very important topic: how to stay true to yourself and live with integrity as a law student and as a lawyer. We oftentimes talk about this as being your authentic self.
It's funny because when I started the Girls Guide to Law School, my tagline, which really I didn't think all that much about, was get in, get through, stay you. And I think it's that final part that really resonated with people, and it's actually the hardest part to do. Law school and being a lawyer can definitely change people, and not necessarily for the better.
Absolutely. I mean, you see that with the high rates of substance abuse and unhappiness in the profession, which we'll talk about later. And we even have a friend who's a lawyer turned psychologist who talks about how even training as a lawyer can make romantic relationships or other personal relationships really rough.
Ooh, we should do an episode on that.
Oh, we should. Yeah, that'll go on the list. Stay tuned. Our friend Linda Alvarez gave a great talk on this topic at the most recent Catapult Conference, and we're going to be pulling heavily from her ideas here. For those of you who don't know her, Linda is an innovative attorney who helps her clients create contracts that align with their values through a process she calls discovering agreement. She's been named an ABA Legal Rebel, and you can find out more about her on her website, discoveringagreement.com, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Linda's fantastic, and you should read some of her stuff. She has a very interesting perspective on how you can practice law. And she's incredibly smart and impressive.
So one of the first things that Linda mentioned was, it's actually very interesting that we even ask these sort of questions about being a lawyer. I mean, some of the ones she brought up were, how do I create an authentic life in the context of my work as a lawyer? Or how can I create a legal career that doesn't create too much dissonance between my nature and my work? I mean, isn't it kind of strange that this is even an issue? For example, I actually have a different professional degree. So before I went to law school, I did a master's in architecture. And nobody in that program, or really in the profession as far as I know about, spent too much time agonizing about whether being an architect was going to destroy their happiness or cause them to do things that they weren't comfortable doing. So, I mean, what is it that's different about the law?
Gosh, I think, what's so different about the law is that pretty much all legal practice is about conflict. And the conflict happens when people, typically multiple parties, are not at all at their best. And I think that really just creates an entire work environment where you are dealing with people in extreme situations who may be making very poor decisions, and you're supposed to manage all of this conflict while still, taking care of yourself, hopefully, and being a person kind of on the outside of that conflict. That's a lot to ask. A lot of professions, I think, don't ask that of people.
Right. I think that's right. I mean, I remember when I left my big law job, for whatever reason, I thought, I'm going to be a family lawyer. This will be great. I'll get to talk to people. I'll get to hear some stories. I mean, thank goodness I took on a pro bono case and realized, you could not pay me enough money to do this every day. It's exactly what you say about people being at their worst. You're dealing with people who are not in a good place and they're behaving badly. And for me, I mean, every time that I had a meeting with opposing counsel and my client and the soon-to-be ex-husband, although that took several years. It made me basically lose faith in humanity. It was horrible. So I think the underlying work is a large part of it. And if you think about something like architecture, like sure, there's stressors, every day, and like maybe you don't have enough money to do what you want, or the client's being kind of a pain, but ultimately you're creating something for the world. And I think there's a value, and friends of mine who are architects, like they take pride in the buildings that they built, and they like to, they bring me by and say, hey, like I did that. And I think that aspect in a way is missing in a lot of law as well. I mean, I think there's this idea of, you're not necessarily fundamentally adding value. I mean, sure, I think there are ways to do it. And I think, the stuff that Linda's working on and lots of other people are working on are great examples. But, if you think of your typical sort of large firm litigation, it's like no one cares who wins. It's existentially pointless. And I think that can be a serious downer too.
It can be. I remember I was working on a trial team when I was at my big law job, and we were working on a toxic torts case, and it was an individual plaintiff, but they were using it as a test case to create lots more litigation. And we were representing the defense, and we won. And I remember getting the email on my BlackBerry saying, yay, we won. And I turned to my husband and I said, oh, we won. And he goes, you just squelched the little guy, like the little guy who got sick, based on the products that you were defending. And I kind of had this moment of like, yeah, but we won.
Yay. Yay. No, I mean, I think that's a large part of the reality is, particularly if you're working as a highly paid attorney, is who can afford to pay you for that. And it's not often the side of right that you would necessarily want to be on.
But I think there are people who are able to find places in the profession where they do feel like they are adding value to the world.
Absolutely.
I have a friend who works with folks on immigration issues, and helps people stay in the country, or asylum issues, and helps people from having to go back to dangerous situations. And I think, their work may feel a lot more like they're contributing to the environment. So it's not necessarily a blanket across the entire profession, but I think a good chunk of the profession is, oftentimes people not behaving at their best.
It can be toxic. I mean, and this is one of the things that we talk about a lot between ourselves is, we're not saying that no one should become a lawyer or that it's bad to be a lawyer. It still has the potential to be a noble profession. And certainly the world needs good lawyers. I think it's just difficult sometimes for people to figure out where exactly they fit into this sort of narrative of like the big, expensive, powerful law firm when that's maybe not what they're interested in doing.
And I think the other problem is oftentimes this discussion doesn't start until you're already practicing law and you're unhappy. And I think...
Right, or you're ready to leave.
Right, or you're so burned out that you're ready to become an ex-lawyer. And I think, some of the law schools are trying to have some of these discussions early on, but I think way too often it's not until you are on a path and you feel like it is having, severe personal ramifications on you. You're not happy. You're not healthy. Maybe it's, hard on your community. You feel like you don't have the personal relationships that you want. There is nothing about work-life balance that could even be connected to what your life is like. And, then it's like, well, now what do I do? Because I'm doing maybe what people told me I was supposed to be doing. And I think it's too late at that point.
Right. And I think a lot of this, I think your point about this starting in law school is a really good one because, the sort of when you show up to law school, and there's actually, I've read a lot of studies on this, and there was this whole sort of movement about critical legal studies and that sort of thing to really critique what it is that law schools are doing on a kind of meta level. And the idea is really, the traditional idea is that this is boot camp. Like you're going to be broken down. You're going to, be this sniveling pile of whatever. And then we're going to build you back up in the form of a lawyer. And a lawyer never makes mistakes and doesn't have feelings and is always rational and is a hired gun. And I think there's still a lot of that in the culture of law school.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think it's problematic.
And I think it just doesn't really manifest itself until you're out there in the world. And when you've already made choices based on, this profession and this life, and because law school oftentimes doesn't have enough practical elements to it. So you don't really appreciate what the practice is like until you get into it. And then, they call it, if you're a highly paid lawyer, the golden handcuffs. You realize that you're not happy, that this isn't authentic to you, that you are not your best self, and you have a mortgage, you might have a family, and now what do you do?
Yeah, and people get trapped. I mean, I remember the judge that I worked for, one of his pieces of advice, he's like, don't take on a mortgage. And we're kind of like, what? He said, because it's fine to go take a job that pays you a lot as a lawyer, but ultimately you're probably going to want to leave. And if you can't leave, that's when you become really miserable. And I think that's something that people really have to take to heart, is really, thinking through, like, what am I signing up for here?
Mm-hmm. So I guess, what our advice is around this is, if you're starting law school or you're in law school right now, it's just good to start kind of asking yourself these questions, and maybe your school is helping you ask yourself these questions. Probably not. Maybe you have mentors. I had a mentor that was pretty good about trying to ask these questions of us. But of course, I naively was like, oh, I love conflict. I'll have no problem with that.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things is, the schools are teaching you to sort of, quote, think like a lawyer. But, at least for me, nobody ever set me down and said, well, you're thinking of being a litigator. Do you like to fight all the time? Because I would have been like, no, not at all. But the reality is that's what you spend your days doing. And it's not just, and I think I think we have this unrealistic idea before you've been in practice where you think like, oh, legal fighting is about making great arguments in a brief. But it's not just about that. I mean, it's an entire sort of ecosystem of conflict because people are just so used to fighting about everything, where it's, everything from, I've certainly had this experience. You probably did. I've heard stories of people, you see a certain opposing counsel's number pop up on your phone, and suddenly like it's this feeling of like you're in a cold sweat because they're going to be unpleasant. And that they're going to be yelling about this, that, or the other. Like, you just know this experience is not going to be a pleasant one. And that's what you deal with, I mean, frankly, a lot of the time, all the time.
And I think that's one of the reasons why this mindfulness movement in the legal profession is kind of getting a little traction. Because although there are folks who are trying to change the legal profession, and I think Linda is one of those people, or at least part of the legal profession. But
sure. And also, I mean, I think a lot of the bar associations, they're talking about civility and all of these things. I mean, people are trying.
They're trying. But I think the one interesting thing about the mindfulness discussion is this idea that, maybe we can't overnight change the way that we work. Conflict seems to be inherent in how much of our practice is done, but maybe we can create some coping skills. So when that number pops up on the phone, if we can close our eyes and take some deep breaths, that maybe we can calm the nerves and calm the body down. So it's not just fight the minute you pick up the phone. And maybe that won't work all the time, but maybe it'll work half of the time. And that's better than nothing,
Right. No, exactly. I mean, it's baby steps. I mean, one of the things that Linda talked about is that lawyers are trained and expected not to have feelings and not to have that emotional reaction, but that's not realistic and it's not really desirable. And the reality is that, suppressing these negative feelings can lead to all sorts of negative consequences like depression, substance abuse, burnout. And I think that is one of the benefits of a more mindful approach to life, is that, it's not that when the phone rings, you say, I'm fine, everything's cool, I'm going to be fine with this phone call. It's like you take that moment and you feel that sensation and you're like literally feel it. And you allow yourself to feel like, oh God, this is not something I want to deal with. But then you pick up the phone and you deal with it anyway. And, this is one of the things that people like Will Meyerhoff talk about. He's an ex-big firm lawyer who is now a therapist. And most of his clients, or at least a large percentage of them, are lawyers. And one of the things he talks about with in his writing is these feelings are going to come out anyway. So you might think that, you might prefer, like, I'm a lawyer, I'm not going to deal with bad feelings, I'm not going to deal with any feelings. But then you look at the rates of substance abuse and depression and suicide and things like that in the legal profession, and they're so much higher than the normal population. And it's not that people who have a tendency to be depressed or suicidal necessarily go to law school. There's studies that they've done on incoming law students, and psychologically, totally normal, maybe like slightly above average in coping skills. But by the end of their first semester, something like 30% of them are clinically depressed. And those numbers just go up. I think, the rates of suicide among attorneys are 2 or 3 times the average profession. These are things that I think are endemic to the profession. But, that's all nice and well, but what are we supposed to do about this? Like, how is it possible to be a balanced or healthy lawyer?
Well, I think that it is a big challenge because, as you said, these skills we learn to kind of disconnect and to, be very hard to fight. They bleed into everything, right? If you are a law student or a lawyer or know law students or lawyers and have ever gotten into a heated argument about anything, whether it be a romantic relationship or something else, I think it has definitely happened that my husband has said something to me like, don't use the lawyer voice. Because that's me like shifting gears, it's like,
and it is this thing you can shift. People ask me sometimes like, well, what did you get out of law school? And the most honest answer I could give them, I hope the FCC is not listening, is to be an asshole on command.
Right.
And it's true. It's like you can turn on a dime and go from like, I'm happy, pleasant, like fun to be around to don't mess with me.
Right.
Like on a dime.
And
I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I know. I don't know if it is either. And I think you have to learn how to check yourself. So, what can we do about this? I think it's to be more aware of, when we want to call on some of these skills, because sometimes I do think these skills are necessary to practice, but we also need to be aware to shut them off.
Right. And like where you're using them, if you're out fighting the good fight, then don't mess with me is a great attitude.
Right.
If you're negotiating with your spouse about where you're going to go to dinner, maybe not.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think trying to kind of realize that you don't want these skills of thinking like a lawyer to necessarily bleed into your entire existence. And I think you need to take care of yourself and remind yourself that there's something else out there in the world, and I think lawyers, because they typically work a lot, can really just live and breathe the law and hang out with other lawyers. And that's can be good from a community perspective, but it can be bad because you kind of forget that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily see the world the way you do. And
right. So I know you grew up with 2 parents who are lawyers.
Did.
So
try winning an argument in my house.
So, have you seen any sort of shift over time and kind of, you mentioned community? Because one of the things I think we hear a lot now is that people feel really disconnected and that there's not really a sense of community among the legal profession necessarily.
Well, growing up, I didn't grow up in the Bay Area. I grew up down in Central California where the community wasn't quite as big. But I grew up going to Bar Association events, and the lawyers and the judges were all friends. And it was kind of boisterous and fun, and there was a camaraderie around the legal profession that I, even as a kid, I could see really made the job feel a bit more robust, because everybody was kind of in it together and the community was pretty strong. And then, of course, you'd meet these people out and about practicing law, and then you would, have had these relationships that you could rely on. And I'm sure at times it helped to dispel some of the conflicts because you had personal relationships with people. If you were all, sharing a glass of wine the night before at a judge's night, maybe, you were a bit more cordial the next day when you headed to court. I think that, bar associations are continuing to have a tough time staying relevant in kind of this new day. And it can be hard to find that community. I think young people, new lawyers are going out and trying to do that through, I think in San Francisco, it's called the Barristers and things like that. But, as we all work more, the billable hours kind of really intense. You're taking less time to be part of the community, and then you don't have the support from other people that are going through exactly what you're going through. And maybe people don't want to seem weak or admit that they're struggling.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at trial once, and the older partner on the team, we'd been to court, something had happened. I think it was good for our side. We were out celebrating. And the opposing counsel's team actually ended up being in the same restaurant, because this is Delaware. You didn't have too many options. And he invited them over, to join us for dinner, and they said no. And he was really offended by that. He said, what happened in court? Like, who cares? Mm-hmm. We're members of the same profession. Like, we should be able to sit down and have a glass of wine and have dinner together. He's like, 20 years ago, this would never have happened. We'd fight the biggest fights. And it's sort of like what you see on the Supreme Court. I mean, it's ironic. I find it ironic that apparently Scalia and Ginsburg are really good friends and they go to the opera together. I do. There couldn't be people who disagreed more on the legal issues.
True.
But, the fact that they can... I think there's even a photo of them that surfaced in a restaurant like the day after the gay marriage opinion came down, and they were having lunch together.
I think they vacationed together, like their families vacation together. I know, it's impressive, but it does show that you could have a mutual respect for people you do not agree with.
Yeah, you strongly disagree with. In fact, one of my best friends from law school was someone I think I agreed with on nothing. Maybe it's because I grew up in the South, and if I was only going to be friends with people who had the same political views that I had, I would have had no friends. But this kind of ties into one of the things that Linda talks about, which is knowing what your values are and having a clear idea about what your lines are. So, for me, one of the values that I probably have as a fundamental value is the idea of tolerating other people's viewpoints. But there's also a certain line that I wouldn't pass in terms of, accepting something that I thought was really horrible. And she defines it as integrity, what she calls a conscious alignment of your actions and your values. And I think this is one of those things that can be really helpful to think about, if you're starting law school or if you're starting your legal career, because this integrity is something that people can't take away from you. And it's the basis of the power that you have in your life. So say, for example, if you're in law school and maybe a classmate wants to cheat on a homework assignment, you know that you're not going to get caught. You're busy, you're stressed out, you're worried about your grade. It's very tempting. What do? It might be tempting to anyone to cheat, and this same idea would apply to, if you're working as a lawyer and the other side calls you and says, we really need an extension on this discovery because someone's child is sick. What's the best thing to do for your client? Well, that's an interesting question because it might be the case that, you'll gain some slight advantage by not allowing that discovery request to go forward. I would actually argue, having been a judicial clerk, that you're shooting yourself in the foot because the last thing that judge wants to do is deal with you denying a 3-day extension because you don't feel like it. It's typically not the sort of thing that judges look on favorably. But her point is, if you know what your core values are, it actually makes things a lot easier because you're not even going to consider denying that extension because you have a core value, for example, of civility and treating other people, even if they're opposing counsel or the opposing client, in a civil manner. Or if you're in school, you're not going to cheat because you have a value of honesty. You'll just say no and you'll move on. And so I think it's worth considering really what your core values are here before you get thrown into these situations like law school or practicing where you're just too busy to think about it.
I think along the same lines, I've had it described to me, and this I think comes out of I can't remember the book, it's the 10 Things Most Successful People Do, or one of those books, but the idea of creating a mission statement for yourself, which is a little bit of those core values, but almost a little bit more specific. And I think that this is an exercise that a lot of people wait to do until they're unhappy and they are trying to make a change instead of, the beginning of a journey, like starting out in law school or while you're in law school and saying, what do I want my life to be like? Like, what are the most important things? If your mission statement is, I want to be a big firm lawyer and that's the most important thing to me and that's all that matters, then, hey, then you could make decisions based on that mission statement.
Right, and to be clear, there's nothing wrong with saying that.
No.
If that's what you want, that's what you want.
And if that's going to make you happy, and I did know people that made them happy, that's fantastic. But I think the issue is that you have to decide that that's going to make you happy and ask yourself if it's going to. So, looking at these core values and then maybe taking it one step further and playing with this idea of a mission statement that might continue to change and evolve as you age and your experiences change. But I think that, it just allows you to make decisions kind of while reflecting on what you've decided is important. Does this go back to what I want for my life?
No, and I think that's so important in law school because I know for me, I kind of went to law school, as I've talked about before, slightly on a whim. But at the same time, I had some underlying idea that this would be something I would be good at, it would be something I could make a living at, but also it would be something useful that I could do for the world. And I feel like, I pretty much failed to articulate for myself what exactly that meant. And as a result, really got kind of swept onto this conveyor belt of Ivy League law school in New York City. There is a clear, in the middle of the boom. And, this hopefully doesn't sound too ungrateful, but basically you're on a path that was not really ultimately where I wanted to end up. And, I hadn't articulated that sufficiently for myself to know that, I had to say no to that 1L summer job at a big firm if that wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Because the reality is, once you start saying yes to these things, you're inherently saying no to other things. And those other things might actually be more aligned with what you really ultimately should be doing.
And that these jobs are great, and they can be great for the right people, the right scenario. But just because you can get one doesn't necessarily mean it's the end all be all. I mean, Alison and I clearly both left big law, and we were both somewhat on that conveyor belt. And there was that assumption of if you get that job offer, you would be insane to turn it down.
Yeah, or literally, for me, I knew I did not want to be on the law review. Mm-hmm. But query why I did the writing competition. Because the point is, once you do the writing competition, and once that phone rings, and once someone's on the other end saying, hey, congratulations, you're on the law review, the response they expect is not, oh, can I have some time to think about it? Which is what I said. And the girl was like, what do you mean? And I said, well, I'm not sure I want to be on the law review. And she's like, well, why did you do the writing competition? I said, well, I don't really know, just to keep my options open. And, there was this sort of pause. We actually had an interesting conversation. And at the end of it, she's like, well, technically speaking, you're allowed to have 24 hours to accept. She's like, but you know that you're going to say yes. So why not just say yes now? She's like, if you didn't want to do this or you weren't willing to do it, you wouldn't have ever done the writing competition. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And then I hated it. But,
right. And I think taking time to just evaluate these decisions. For me, prior to law school, I was a consultant at a big international consulting firm, and I did not love working for a big corporation. I traveled all the time for work. I worked crazy hours. We had very demanding clients.
Sounds like big law.
Yeah, well, ironically, that was the funny part, is because I left that saying oh, this makes me really unhappy and I don't want any of my boss's jobs. I have to go back to school. And then I literally got the same job in the legal marketplace. I just didn't have to travel all the time. And when I decided it wasn't working out for me, I did have this moment of clarity of I feel like I've been here before.
Yeah, maybe this seems familiar. What am I doing?
And maybe this seems familiar. Right. And I kind of wonder why I didn't slow down and stop and ask myself some of these questions in law school. So I think one of the things we just want you guys to get out of this talk is if you're in law school or you're getting ready to exit law school, or even if you're a new lawyer, it's never too late to start asking yourself these questions. Even if you're busy, you should take some time and think about how do you want to treat people? What are your core values? How do you want to treat yourself? What do you want your life to look like? What will you do or not do in pursuit of a goal? Whether it's a good grade or a job or a letter of recommendation from a professor. I think looking at the big picture, why you're in law school to begin with, is it a solely selfish decision, or did you want to do some good for the world? Do you want that big firm corporate job? Is it going to make you happy? What's calling you to do this sort of work? These are all really valid questions. And if you can't slow down and ask yourself these questions, I think, then you really want to pause and say, why can't I even sit down and do some of this self-evaluation?
Yeah, I think if you're afraid to even think about these questions, that's probably a sign that you should be devoting some pretty serious time and thought to it. And frankly, you should probably have someone helping you, whether that's someone who is an ex-lawyer or a therapist or whatever, because it's not easy for people to just, to really say, what is it that I want? Mm-hmm. And there are all these conflicting pressures. you probably heard this when you left Big Law. I heard it when I left Big Law. Like, you're failing feminism. Mm-hmm. You have an obligation to stay there and be a partner, which that's a whole other podcast.
That is. And actually, I do believe, Alison, you and I have sat in the same talks where people said that to us as well.
Yes, we have. I recall at least 1 or 2 instances, and people have said it to me. People have said it to me directly, in an email or whatever. It was literally like, you have failed feminism by quitting your Big Law job and doing this like blogging thing, whatever it is that you're tootling around doing.
Right.
But it is hard. I mean, it took me more than a year after I decided, like, I'm not happy in my Big Law job to quit, because you're just like, what am I doing? Like, I've worked so hard for this and I've paid so much money for this, and everybody thinks it's so great, and like, maybe I could be a partner, and that would be cool. And then you're like, no, it wouldn't be cool. It'd be horrible. So I think, but the good news about large firm jobs is they tend to be so horrible ultimately that you have to leave. But it doesn't mean you have to leave the profession. And I think for me, I don't know if I'd say it's a lingering regret, but it's definitely something that I feel like if I'd had a little bit more motivated direction in the beginning, I probably could have been much happier and might still be practicing law and might still be doing something useful in the legal profession. But
I'm sure glad that you didn't, because then we get to do stuff like that.
I say, not that we're not doing something useful, but in a different form.
It is. And I do think that, it's so easy to forget about your motivations for being in school and what kind of life you want. That you almost really do have to set aside time and check in with yourself. And, maybe you decide that you do that every year on your birthday, or, at the new year, or just create times of reflection. Because I think if you don't, it can be easy to become kind of on this conveyor belt path. And then all of a sudden you find out that you have reached a point in your life that you didn't really expect to be at. Life is happening right now while you're doing other stuff. So
yeah, 5 or 10 years down the road, you're like, oh, whoa, how did I end up here? Not ideal.
So, one of the things we'd encourage everybody to do now is to take some time, write down your motivations, write down your core values, write yourself a mission statement, and then, refer back to them. It's not something that'll happen in 5 minutes. You probably have to spend some time doing it. And if you are having trouble, we have some friends that do this sort of work, coaches and therapists and people who counsel folks who are struggling with where they want to be in the legal profession. And we're happy to connect you with people that can kind of help you on this journey. We're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and ratings on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon on a future episode of this podcast.